It's hard to read, watch, or listen to the news regularly without hearing about the danger of global warming or climate change. But our next guest offers an alternative viewpoint on this topic. Dr. Bill Lynch is a fellow at the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, and he's been looking into this issue for a long time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So you approach this basically by looking at the compound that's at the heart of this debate, carbon dioxide or CO2, and looking at the way that CO2 actually operates. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, CO2 is a perfect absorber for the infrared that the Earth has to release every time it's releasing energy. Gets sunlight, comes in, and for every watt that comes in, or watt hour that comes in, has to be released in that same 24-hour period for you to have a equilibrium. So CO2 is very vulnerable to this radiation coming off from the Earth, and so that's where a lot of the blanket comes from. So it's very important. But when it's all said and done, and you look at how much of the final blanket, which is the part of the energy that comes into the Earth, it's like a mini sun. The sun's there, now you get a blanket. Oops, it's hotter because you got another mini sun here. But CO2 is only producing 25% of that. And yet all the plots say, oh yeah, we move CO2 up. Look what happens. Well, CO2 is only paying 25% of the final contribution. In today's conditions, it's only 25%. So I knew that, and I started trying to look at whether CO2 really was more vulnerable. You used to hear that it sets up chain reactions. That's what they did in the 90s. There were chain reactions, and everything was going to happen. What could they possibly be? Well, there are no chain reactions that are occurring. When CO2 warms the temperature, it will warm it by a little bit. If you add some CO2, you add a little bit of temperature. It doesn't do anything to the rest of the universe. It just raises the temperature. When it raises the temperature, all the other absorbers, let's say that's 75%, take advantage of those extra photons that are coming off because of a little bit of extra temperature. They absorb more. They absorb more, and the blanket goes up. So the blanket goes up by X amount, but 25% of it is due to CO2. And CO2, you could say, is a cause. But, if the other elements, you added more of the other elements, you'd have the same effect. If you added more water, it would raise the temperature, and then you blame water for raising the whole thing. So it's a very simple molecule. It's very sensitive to absorption. It's like a piano string that you raise. The tuning fork is the radiation that's coming off, and that piano string really likes it. So CO2 is very sensitive. It's very resonant with it. So it works. It's making the climate warmer, but it's not as drastic as some people would say.
And so those who say that higher levels of CO2 are guaranteeing all kinds of problems in our future are overstating what CO2 can do?
Absolutely. Because nature does not allow that to happen. In effect, nature prevents calamities from happening. Look at it this way. The total amount of energy that mankind is creating through its own effort, through its own machinery, carbon, whatever, is 1/100% of the energy we get from the sun. And the sun is spending 10% of that energy just picking up a ruckus in the tropics, making all that water pour up into the crown above the tropics. So that goes up there. That's 10% of the sun's energy is doing that. And we're putting out, if we applied everything we had, we've got 0.01% of the sun's energy. So there's the sun, and then there's the energy in the rotation of the Earth. There's a lot of other factors too. So CO2 contributes a small amount of temperature, but there's no way you could say it causes a runaway. If they say plus 2 degrees, plus 3 degrees, well, the temperature changes by plus or minus 10 to 15 degrees centigrade every day. Or, and around the world it changes plus or minus, I'm going to say 40 degrees centigrade. Nothing runs away. Nature, when it's disturbed, always comes back to an equilibrium. What the perfect example of is when you have a lightning strike. There's a problem up there that you've got 8,000 volts between here and then. The best way to resolve it is so you have this lightning bolt, and the problem is solved. So that, I mean, it doesn't care about our stuff. Nature doesn't care about our stuff, but it solves its own problem.
We're speaking with Bill Lynch, and it sounds as if perhaps that the people who are making a big deal about CO2 and rising levels of CO2 are focusing a lot on these climate models and less on how the actual material, carbon dioxide, works. Is that a fair way to say it?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think the physicists are all, the climatologists, physicists are all doing their job. It's just that the papers that get selected and get chosen and get publicized are in that band that are on the outer fringe of possibility, probability, but not likelihood. And so I'll give you an example. Right now, the IPCC has reduced its claims. Let me back up a bit. In the 90s, they used to say that you raise the CO2 by 100 parts per million, the temperature go up by 1 degree centigrade. That's what really made me know that something was wrong, because by 250 parts per million, all the really sensitive parts of the spectrum have been sucked up by CO2 molecules already. Put more CO2, all you do is get that absorption closer to the Earth. It's going to absorb it all. It just absorbs it all at those frequencies. So they said it was every 100 parts per million would raise it by 1 degree. I knew that didn't make any sense. And anyway, papers came out then that wasn't correct. And I actually made my own logarithm plot. In my little old logarithm plot, I used log 10 of CO2, and I figured it out. And it's like nowhere near linear. It doesn't want to keep going up. But other scientists figured that out. And I noticed that suddenly the IPCC changed their reports to be more correct. They had a log 2 model in there in which they said, well, if you raise CO2 and double it, the temperature is going to go up by, I think earlier they said 2.5 to 5 or 4.5 degrees centigrade. And now they're saying 2 to 4. So they're pulling the number down. So 2 degrees centigrade is a lot lower than 4.5 degrees centigrade, I'll tell you that. But it looks like the real model that other people are getting, from what I understand besides me, is like 1 degree centigrade jump for every doubling. That's not a serious problem for, in the next 100 years, you're likely to get another 1 degree centigrade.
In the brief time that we have left, some people are going to hear us and say, well, that's a lot of science, a little bit more than I understand. Mm. For you, what's the bottom line about what people should know about what CO2 does?
Well, CO2 does warm the planet. It's any extra energy you put into the planet every year. If the sun raised its output that was getting to the Earth by 0.01% a year, it would have an effect on our climate. That small amount of extra energy gift to us, if you did it every year, it would raise the temperature. So it is doing that. It does raise the temperature. But when they say it's going to have a runaway, that's the problem that the most, what I call it, fear cum belief, where you have a fear and it turns into a belief. You make it and now it becomes a gospel. That's what's been happening, a fear cum belief, that we're going to have a catastrophe if the temperature goes up by 2 degrees centigrade. Well, there is not going to be a catastrophe. For there to be a catastrophe, for every watt per square meter of energy that I added through a blanket, I would have to get 1 point plus something back as blanket for it to have a runaway. Runaway says you've got to get more back, positive feedback. The situation now is that the maximum you can get back is 65%. That's a long way from greater than 1. Most you can get back 65%. And then in addition, there's this lovely little term that's usually forgotten about, and that's what's called the adiabatic effect. When radiation goes up from the Earth, it automatically loses 140 watts per square meter. So it's a gift. So by the time you're finished, if you add that in, when you add another couple of watts per square meter from anything, from CO2 or anything else, you can only get 35% extra back as blanket. So the blanket goes up, but it goes up at a slower rate than your input. If it's going up at a slower rate than the input, it is not a runaway. The temperature is going to go up. It can be steady, it can be anything, but it cannot be a runaway because there is not a positive feedback.